Number 3. 2 days after graduating high school, my two best friends and I decided to take a camping trip on a mountain that was frequented by the locals. Although it's by no means in the middle of nowhere, the town that it's located in is a bit smaller and by no means a bustling metropolis. My friends, Brian and Greg, were 2 years older than me and had taken the trip to celebrate their graduation, and figured they would introduce me to my college-age years by doing the same thing. We packed up all the necessities: tent, chairs, horrible light beer, the whole 9 yards. It was nearing dusk when we began hiking up to the camping area, which was about 4 miles or so from the base of the mountain. We set up camp and shot the shit, exchanging drunken anecdotes while snacking on the burnt hot dogs that we attempted to cook in the on-site fire pit, and eventually passed out at about 2 a.m. Not long after nodding off, a noise snapped me out of my sleep. I was still pretty intoxicated, but I could make out what sounded like music coming from outside the tent. I assumed that it was Greg or Brian's phone going off, and I tried to ignore the sound. Rolling over, it was at this point that I realized I no longer had my blanket or pillow in the tent with me. And upon opening my eyes, I realized that this was not in fact the tent that we had set up at all. It was just a tarp which had been fashioned into a makeshift lean-to. My buzz was instantly replaced with a full-blown panic as I broke out into a cold sweat. I peered out of the lean-to and saw what the actual cause of the music was. A cassette player was sitting in the grass about 10 feet away from the tarp and was playing what sounded like a homemade recording of a little girl singing. The only other defining feature at this campsite was the clothesline. One end was fixed to a tree, the other on the ground, and there were 3 white dresses hanging from it, swaying slightly in the breeze. The whole thing was unsettling as fuck, to say the least. I was still trying to make sense of what was going on when I heard walking in the forest about 50 yards away. I froze, not wanting to believe what I was experiencing, hoping that when I opened my eyes, I would be back at the tent. No such luck. The rustling slowly got closer and closer. The tape abruptly clicked as it came to an end, and the rustling became what sounded like a full-blown sprint. I tore off down the mountain, stumbling a few times and ripping open my knee on the gravelly trail. I didn't even realize it or feel the pain until the next day. I was so full of adrenaline. I don't know how the fuck I managed to make it back to the base of the mountain where we had parked. I locked myself in my car and waited until morning. I guess I managed to fall back asleep because I was awoken by Greg tapping on my driver's side window. He and Brian gave me shit about how I was such a pussy for not being able to stick it out the whole night on the mountain. I let them rag on me because I figured it would be easier than trying to explain the truth to them, and I didn't want to revisit it myself. It wasn't until a couple of weeks later that I dared to ask the question that had been nagging at me. I couldn't help but how they figured I would be back at the car. I asked Brian when we were hanging out and playing video games a couple of nights later, and he told me that they had got my note and then just assumed that I had gotten scared and went back to the car. I asked him what note he was referring to, as I definitely had no recollection of leaving one. He swore I did, and said that he still had it in his camping bag. After rummaging around a few minutes, he produced a scrap of paper that simply said, "Out walking." I slowly nodded and said that I guess I must have sleep-wrote it. He laughed as he crumbled it up and tossed it into the garbage can. It's been 3 years since that night, and I can't explain the events of that camping trip, but I do know one thing. That note wasn't in my handwriting. Number 2. So I would consider camping my passion. It's the only hobby I have that I take so much interest in and I get really excited to do. More specifically, camping alone. Of course, I camp with friends every once in a while, but nothing matches the experience of camping out in the wild, alone. There's something about sitting by a fire you made yourself until late and going to bed with nothing but the sounds of the wild to accompany you. Of course, camping alone also means I experience some pretty scary shit. Usually it's animals, howls and cries from the woods that send chills down your spine, or animals that take interest in your tent. I had bears sniff and bat at my tent, which is absolutely terrifying and usually keeps me up the rest of the night. I make sure I don't keep any food in my tent though, so no animals should ever really want to go into my tent. The scariest thing to encounter out in the wild, however, is another person. You would think that animal and human footprints sound relatively similar, but they don't. I've only had it happen twice now. The first time, it was just passing footsteps in the grass. They didn't do anything, but it still scared me shitless. The second time, someone stopped and waited for a while. They sounded about 20 feet from my tent. I was holding my breath until they just walked off again. However, about a month ago, I had my scariest experience. It was probably about 2 a.m. I had been lying in my sleeping bag for about an hour, just listening to the sounds of the wild, when I heard footsteps approaching. I remember how they sounded as they brushed through the grass. They kept getting closer and closer, and at this point I was pretty freaked. It sounded like they were directly approaching my tent, and that they were. They stopped right in front of the entrance of my tent. I was trying my hardest to keep my breathing quiet. I always take a handgun with me when I go camping, just to stay safe from animals. That was the first thing that came to my mind when they stopped in front of my tent. I needed that gun. As quietly as I could, I reached into my open backpack, feeling around softly through the clothing and such. I finally found the gun and pulled it out carefully. I held it tightly, staring at my tent door. What happened next really made me panic. The person outside my tent started to unzip my tent door. It was slow, like they were trying to be quiet. At this point, I was thinking, no more assumptions. You need to make sure you don't get murdered. I flipped the safety off on my gun. The person stopped unzipping my tent. After that click, I then choked out the words, "Who's there? I have a gun." After that, the person ran off faster than I had ever heard anyone run. I couldn't shut my eyes after that. I was shaking. I thought for sure I was either going to be killed or kill someone that night. I still go camping alone to this day. The scariness is honestly the best part about it. You never know what you're going to encounter. Number 1. My dad is a journalist and a nonfiction writer, but at the time he was a reporter for the Virginian Pilot, based out of Virginia. He was working on a new book titled The Big Roads when this occurred. We often went on road trips for his research needs, and once his proposal for his new book was accepted, we went on a cross-country road trip from Virginia to California and back, on Route 66. Me being 13 at the time, I demanded that he let me bring along a friend, and so we were 3. The first quarter of our month-long adventure went off without a hitch. We either stayed in motels with the occasional stay at a grand old historic hotel. My dad, being the outdoors man that he is, decided that we should camp about 5 or 6 times throughout the trip. The first night we camped, we were in the middle of literal nowhere. No one for at least 20 miles on either side, in the middle of the Utah desert. When we arrived at our campsite in our rented minivan, my dad wanted to explore a bit because at the bottom of the hill that our campsite was situated on was an old Pony Express stop. My friend decided to stay in the minivan until my dad and I had finished checking out the old Pony Express stop. We were utterly alone, and as a rather jumpy and skittish 13-year-old girl, it became apparent to me that we were isolated to the point that if anything happened, we would be screwed. That's all I could think about as my dad and I walked down the hill to explore. We checked out the old station, and everything seemed to be going smoothly until we were about halfway back up the hill. A large truck that we noticed driving down the old dirt road a few minutes before had turned into the campsite. We were surprised but didn't really think anything of it. Maybe this guy was on an adventure too. The truck parked halfway up the road and a man got out. He had what I think was a hunting rifle and started hunting around the area that my dad and I were in. About 50 feet from our campsite, Of course, this was an absolute no hunting zone, and my dad became a bit concerned because my friend was closer to the stranger than she was to us. He yelled out to the man, saying that there were children around and he couldn't hunt there. As soon as the man turned to face us, I got an overwhelming sense of complete doom. I felt in my entire body that something was not right. The man looked us over, and without saying a word, he aimed his gun at us. My dad does not carry a gun or knife or any kind of weapon. I felt trapped. My dad ushered me behind a large boulder, but he didn't hide. He stood his ground. There was a solid minute of this man aiming his gun at my dad, and my dad standing completely still, staring back. In my mind, I considered all the ways that this could go down. I was absolutely terrified that this guy would shoot my dad, and somehow my friend and I would have to escape or get murdered during this tense minute. The guy lowered his gun, cocked his head to the side, and pointed at my dad using fake gun fingers, and fake shot him. He then got in his truck and drove away. That night, my friend and I slept in the minivan in 90-degree heat because I was positive this guy would come back and murder us all. We had a few other creepy incidents that occurred on that trip, but we ended up fine and safe after all.
There's always a reason to be afraid.